Hi, my lovelies. Today we're looking at topic 2.5, the demographic transition model. Our tidbit of the day is that Mexico City, the capital of Mexico, is sinking at a rate of 3.2 feet per year and has actually sunk 32 feet over the last 60 years. This is largely because it was built on an artificial island on a lake, originally by the Aztecs. In 1521, the Spanish invaders started building on top of the Aztec ruins, and it still is sinking today. So our learning objectives for the day are to explain theories of population decline and growth. So we're looking at the demographic transition model, and we're looking at the epidemiological transition model. The demographic transition model represents the shift in growth in the world's population over time. So it's historic and it's ongoing. It's based on CBR and CDR trends with stages characterized by the religion. So here we see the DTM in graph form, and we see at least 4 stages basically anytime that we're looking at this, and realistically we're seeing 5 stages anymore. Let's look at the CBR, the crude birth rate throughout each of the stages. So that's our yellow line. Stage 1, it's very high. Stage 2, it stays really high. Stage 3, it starts to decline. Towards the latter half, it's really fast decline. Stage 4, it's still declining and gets very low. And then in stage 5, it's extremely low and still decreasing. And then our CDR, our crude death rate, our green line. Stage 1, it's really high. Stage 2, it's rapidly declining. Stage 3, it's still declining, but it's pretty slow now. Stage 4, it's fairly level. And stage 5, it may even start increasing. And what that's doing is the space between these two lines is our natural increase rate. So towards the end, we actually are going to start to see a negative increase rate, meaning that our population is actually going to start decreasing. And then finally, our total population. So when birth and death rates are really high, we have basically no population growth and very little low population. It starts to rapidly increase in stage 2, getting really high in stages 3 and 4, and then potentially declining in stage 5. And we're going to look at that a little bit more closely now. So stage 1 is our stage of low growth. This is high stationary, meaning that our population is stationary, but deaths and births are both very, very high. It's not going anywhere. So there is basically no long-term natural increase. This is largely our early humans and hunter-gatherer societies, meaning that it doesn't really exist in large numbers anymore. There are no countries in stage 1. There are small populations, generally pretty tribal and isolated. So there's a few things to note with this one. First off, we have a high infant mortality rate. Lots of babies being born, lots of babies dying. We also die of other things, but in general, if we have so many babies dying, they're going to have more of them. It's a very quick turnover. Secondly, there's a lack of family planning. If we have this many children dying, we're not really worried about contraception. We probably don't have access to it. So no family planning whatsoever. This is exacerbated by the idea that children are financial assets. The more children you have, the more help you have. So if you're hunter-gatherers, eventually your children might grow up to become hunter-gatherers as well. They'll help out the family. And historically speaking, certain cultural groups or religions tended to have more children. So traditionally, Hindus, Catholics, Muslims, they tended to have larger families. Again, not a lot of family planning. Children are seen as financial assets. It's all going to work towards having more of them. Plus, when a lot of them are dying, you got to replace them. And important to note that that's not necessarily true anymore for those groups. So reasons that we have a high CDR during this time, we have very high disease, we have high rates of famine, we have a lot of war or violence. We also end up with very poor hygiene and sanitation. We don't have any health care. If you break your leg, you're probably going to die because there's no one or not a lot of medical intervention to fix that. And we'll talk more about that later on. Our second stage is our high growth stage. So this is early expanding. And what we're seeing is that we have that very, very high crude birth rate, and our crude death rate is rapidly declining. And this happens for a number of reasons, which we're going to talk about. So what we end up with is a very high natural increase rate. In the Western world, this particularly began to happen with the Industrial Revolution. So Britain and the United States both hit it around the 1700s to 1800s, and we start to see our populations exploding. Later on in history, other countries are going to start to enter stage 2 in places like Africa and South and Southeast Asia and South America with the medical revolution. So they don't necessarily have the industry, but they do now have medicine that's going to keep them healthier and let them live longer, including the babies, things like vaccines and stuff like that. So now we're going to see these massive rates of increase. Another example is Afghanistan currently. So if we look up here in the top corner, we'll see the Afghanistan population pyramid from 2016. And this is what a stage 2 population pyramid will pretty much just always look like. Really wide base, really narrow top, meaning that we have a lot of very young people, especially a lot of very small children, and not very many old people. They're just not living that long. So during this stage, the reasons that we have such a high crude birth rate are basically the same as the stage 1. We have no family planning. We're used to having high infant mortality rates. We still have kind of high, but they're much lower. So now a lot of those babies that would have died before are surviving, but people are still in that cultural mindset where we need to have more babies. Babies are financial assets. This is what our religion or culture is telling us to do. We need to have more babies. But our CDR is starting to decline because we have improved sanitation, we have improved health, largely due to things like increased nutrition. We don't have as many wars or famines going on. We have better access to clean drinking water and other sanitation. Overall, we have increased medical intervention and treatments. And important to note, these stage 1 and stage 2 places, particularly stage 2, because this actually exists on the country scale, these are our periphery countries, those outside ones. Stage 3 is our stage of decreasing growth. So it's still high, especially towards the first half of a stage 3. And we would also consider it the late expanding. So the population is still expanding quite a bit, but we're in the later stages of expansion. So our birth rates still are starting out high, but then they're going to be in a rapid decline. Our death rates are in a decline, but it's much softer, much slower. And our natural increase rate is beginning to balance. So stage 3 countries are what we would consider semi-periphery, kind of industrialized, and that's going to be a lot of what's moving them to stage 3, and a big shift in culture. So what we start to see is that the status of women is changing. Women are now coming out of the homes. They might be going into the workforce. Culturally, they're seen more equal than they used to be. They've gained access to education in addition to employment, and they now are going to start having access to contraception. Infant mortality rates at this time are going to be very low. So we have gotten into the cultural mindset of, hey, babies aren't dying so quickly, and maybe we don't need to have so many of them because they're kind of expensive. We don't need so many. With an increase in welfare and retirement benefits, we don't need children to take care of the elderly population anymore also. So that's going to be another reason for that cultural shift to fewer children. And finally, as we have more and more people living in urban areas, we have less room. So families are going to want to decrease simply because it's hard to fit a whole bunch of children into small housing. Okay, stage 4. So this is our stage of low growth, or it's a low stationary. Low crude birth rate and crude death rate, not a whole lot of movement. So we have very low birth and death rates, no natural increase, and possibly even starting to decrease. And this is characterized by zero population growth, or ZPG. This is when our CBR is less than or equal to our CDR. What we see is that our CBR is low for the same reasons as stage 3. Cultural shift, family planning, and no particular reason to have a whole lot of children. They're financial burdens rather than financial assets. And our low CDR, crude death rate, is for the same reasons in stage 2 and 3. We have good hygiene, good sanitation, lots of healthy foods, and medical intervention. So we're not dying at the rates that we used to. And finally, we get to stage 5. And this is still kind of seen as hypothetical, but realistically it exists. So it might exist for different reasons, and that's sort of that hypothetical part of it. So what we see here is negative growth. This is our declining stage. Our population decline, our CDR is greater than our CBR. We have a negative NIR. And we see two possible policies related to this. The first one are pro-natalist policies. So natal refers to children being born, newborns, like neonatal. This is pro-birth policies. And these are laws and programs that encourage reproduction. So a couple of examples are Denmark and Japan, which have very low birth rates and are trying to get more children because ultimately what they're worried about is their population dying off entirely. So we're going to watch a quick video. It's about 2 minutes on a policy in Denmark. And it's a little bit naughty, but not bad. It's called Do It for Denmark.
Kan sex redde Danmarks fremtid? Danmark har et problem. Fødselsraten er den laveste i 27 år, og der fødes ikke nok børn til at forsørge den aldrende befolkning. Skiftende regeringer har ikke kunne løse problemet, men der må være en løsning. Her er Emma. Hun er dansker, men selvom hun er født og opvokset i Danmark, er hun undfanget i Paris. Lige deroppe på det der hotelværelse. For 30 år siden tog Emmas forældre en lille sviptur. Hvis vægge kunne tale. Men det viser sig, at Emmas historie ikke er så enestående. 10% af alle danske børn er undfanget på en ferie.
At rejse og få nye oplevelser, det påvirker parforholdet, fordi de får overskud til at se og opleve hinanden på ny. Det frigør endorfiner i hjernen, og så får folk lyst til sex. Det får vi børn af.
Faktisk har danskerne 46% mere sex på ferier sammenlignet med hverdagen. Så for at hjælpe den faldende danske fødselsrate, vil Spis opfordre alle danskere til at tage på en romantisk storbyferie. Det hjælper selvfølgelig også lidt på vores fremtidige forretning. Men er det ikke motivation nok at gøre det for Danmark, så har vi lavet en lille konkurrence. Book din rejse med vores ægløsningsrabat. Fyr den af. Bevis, du har undfanget et barn, og vind 3 års forbrug af babyudstyr og en børnevenlig ferie. Men hvad nu, hvis du allerede har gjort din pligt? Eller hvis chancerne for en undfangelse ikke er særlig høje, jamen så se på det sådan her. Det handler ikke kun om at vinde. Det handler om at være med. Deltag i konkurrencen. Do it for Denmark.
Okay, so you can see it's a little bit naughty, but basically the idea is that they want people to go on holiday because on holiday they're more relaxed and they're more likely to conceive children, and hopefully by this point you guys all know how babies are made. That's not a conversation I'm having with you. But they want people to have children because their population is declining so much, and they've done it in a way where they actually encourage people to go and try to conceive children by creating a competition and offering discounts to go on vacations. Then we have anti-natalist policies. These are anti-birth policies, and they're intended to discourage reproduction. So hopefully we're all familiar with China's one-child policy. This is no longer in place, but if you remember looking at the maps in class, we saw how much the population isn't growing. So the population is still very, very high, but it's not growing at a very high rate anymore, which is what they wanted out of that. Another one is Singapore. So in the 70s to the 80s, Singapore wanted to limit people's having children to 2 children. And that's the little posters that we see down here saying that have children farther apart time-wise and limit yourselves to 2. So over on the left-hand side, we're looking at population, and on the bottom, we're looking at years by decade. So we see that over time, we've seen some very significant increases. North America has been fairly limited. Latin America has been definitely elevated, but not super high. Europe has been pretty stagnant and actually has gone down. And we see, or is going down, and we see kind of the same increases in other parts of the world, where Africa has the by far most drastic increase. And when we're looking at developing countries or less developed countries versus more developed, our population by age is much higher in LDCs than it is in MDCs. So we're looking at about 40% in 1950 to 1975, where at the same time It was only about 25% in MDCs and has gone down, but kind of stayed fairly similar across the decades and into the future. So in thinking about the demographic transition model, we want to think of some limitations. The major one comes in that it's based on the Western world, so Western Europe and the United States and Canada largely. And that's a problem because they industrialized much earlier, they had significant economic booms, and those are things that might not happen in the same way in other parts of the world, the parts that are developing now. So it may not hold true as we move into the future, and that's kind of a limitation because it doesn't give us a lot of place to go, but it still can be very useful for us. All right, so moving forward, we're looking at the epidemiologic transition, and this is similar to, but separate from the demographic transition model. It's the way that health evolves as demographics and development change, and it's essentially what we die from over time. So epidemiology is the study of disease, and we're looking at largely what's killing people, mostly related to the diseases over time. This does not directly correlate with the DTM. So it's similar to, but not quite the same as. But in stage 1, this is the stage of famine. People are having infectious and parasitic diseases, they die from animal attacks, and essentially our effects are that we have a very high CDR and life expectancy is very low. People tend to die very, very young. Regionally, we see this in places in sub-Saharan Africa, in rural India, and in South America. Diseases at this stage are things like the bubonic plague. And this largely results from people moving closer together, increasing the rate of infection. Basically, we look at it as natural checks on the population. The second stage is the stage of receding pandemics, so pandemics that are kind of starting to die back. We have improved sanitation, nutrition, and medicine that lower the spread of infection. One of the big things here is that we start eating more salt, and while salt is bad in high quantities, it is necessary for life. The effects are that the CDR decreases and life expectancy increases. We see this a lot in places like China, especially in a little bit more rural areas and in a lot of places in India. We have diseases here like cholera and hemorrhagic fever, and we often see this in urban areas that are not heavily developed in terms of sanitation. Our third stage is the stage of degenerative and human-created diseases, so diseases that break you down over time, break your body down. And we see an increase in disease related to aging. So heart disease, cancer, stroke, things like that. The CDR is low, the life expectancy increases. This is pretty common in places like urban India, in the former Soviet Union, and in indigenous communities. Mostly what people are dying from is disease related to obesity, to heart disease, to stroke, and to cancer. Next up, we have stage 4, the stage of delayed degenerative disease. Our medical advances are reducing or delaying the incidence of age-related diseases, and life expectancy is at its highest. Basically, we have medications and treatments for things like cancer and heart disease, so life is increased, but it doesn't totally cut out those diseases. It just means that we're dying from them later on. We also might start seeing things like Alzheimer's as more prevalent here. Then we have stage 5, our reemergence of infectious diseases. This is the stage where infectious and parasitic diseases are coming back. They're becoming resistant to antibiotics and they are increasing. And our life expectancy overall is decreasing. We see this in places all over the world, but including places like Russia and the United States. What we see here is things like HIV and AIDS, sometimes Ebola, mumps and measles, polio, tuberculosis, even COVID-19. Things are resistant to antibiotics and other treatments, and when people are choosing not to get vaccines, they are propagating the increase of formally eradicated diseases like measles and polio. All right, so a couple of the problems that we see with the ETM or limitations is that it doesn't necessarily differentiate between a specific cause of disease and a combination of causes. That overall mortality rate might be skewed. It also doesn't really account for that the number one cause of disease is poverty. So the less money you have, the less medical intervention you can get. It also doesn't necessarily address the changes in how people live. So food consumption and lifestyle choices often may be difficult to predict what's going to happen to people. Think about people today who say, oh, I live to be 100 because I smoked cigars every single day and I drink a glass of whiskey every single day. Well, for some people that might be fine, and for other people those may be causes of death. We also have issues with things like pesticides or spoiled foods, vaccines, and treatments that we give to animals to make them more productive for food sources that could be detrimental to human health. And it doesn't really regard some of our chronic diseases that might be caused by environmental factors. So exposure to things like asbestos or other chemicals that might create long-term problems. And finally, that highly mobile population, we see increased infection rates. So all of those are not really accounted for necessarily in the ETM, but are really important and necessary to understand how disease impacts human life. Okay, that's it. So our learning objective, we wanted to explain theories of population growth and decline, specifically looking at the DTM to use it to explain population change over time, and the ETM to explain the causes of changing death rates. So I want you to do 3 things: describe one value of the demographic transition model, and describe one limitation of the epidemiologic transition, and then explain how present-day measles outbreaks fit into the ETM. And that's it for today. So make sure you're reading in your textbook. Go back and rewatch parts of the video if you need to understand it a little bit better, if you missed anything. And let me know if you have any questions. Pop them in the Chapter 2 Padlet. Have a great day. Bye.